that I think this is actually one of the most important, fights that agriculture really needs to be paying attention to. Right now, for agriculture, there is a difference between farmers and big ag.
Is that people will gleefully say, we need to get rid of this glyphosate. And the politicians aren't going to stop this. They're going to say, oh, if this is what it takes for me to get elected, then I'll get rid of glyphosate too. And suddenly we'll be using all sorts of other herbicides that are way worse. And then they'll just start targeting those. If you can get rid of glyphosate, you can get rid of anything.
We're in a world of extremes. We're in a world of extremes when it comes politically. We're in a world of extremes online. Everything seems to be in the extremes. And I'm we're never going to be able to find the answer that actually moves us forward. A moderate approach, a logical approach is missing to the conversation.
I'm going to disagree with you because I actually do think we need a massive reduction in regulations, almost to the point of them being no regulations. And I'm sure my audience is rolling their eyes and flipping out. But
it's not about getting people to understand what glyphosate is or isn't, or all of these details that sometimes we argue over, or educating our consumer, which you'll hear all the time. For me, it's about none of that. That is not what will get us to come out on the right side of this and be seen as the people that are doing the right thing every single day out for their animals and out on the land. It is trust. That is what we have to focus on when it comes to consumer.
I'm Brian Mose, a farmer living in Florence, South Dakota, and you're listening to the Vance Crow Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today's guest is Natalie Kovarik. But before I get to describing why I brought her on the show, I should probably explain, what am I doing in my truck? Well, we have been incredibly busy at Legacy Interviews. In fact, I had to run out and grab some more stuff. And the reason we're so busy is because people are trying to get their Legacy Interviews in time that we can get it back to them before Thanksgiving. This is when they can sit around with their whole family and watch these interviews. And one of the things that I often describe about Legacy Interviews is it's not just the experience that your loved one will get telling their stories, but the experience of watching it with your family is a profound one that people write us about and say, I had no idea how amazing this experience would be. So I'm running around, I'm super busy, and I forgot to do the intro to the conversation with Natalie. I found Natalie because I was going through one of those things on X where they say, hey, what's a good ag podcast to listen to? I clicked on Discover Ag, of which Natalie is the co-host. And at first I thought, this isn't really an ag podcast. They're talking about Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift and some Instagram person that posts about their farm. And then all of a sudden I realized, no, wait, this is ag. This is a huge portion of the culture of ag. And Natalie knows a huge amount about how ag and consumers fit together. So when the RFK hearings came out about the food system and all the changes that need to happen, I invited Natalie on to talk about it. We have an amazing conversation about the incredible tension going on in ag right now and how the political foundations that held them up when GMOs and pesticides were being questioned is now shifted underneath their feet. And many of the political homes that they had before are now gone. Natalie has a detailed understanding of how consumers think, and she also works on her family's first generation cattle ranch. This is a great conversation. I was bowled over by just how much Natalie knew, and I'm excited to bring this to you. Now, let's go back to Legacy Interviews for a second. If you're interested in having me record your loved ones' life stories so that future generations have the opportunity to know their history, then go to legacyinterviews.com, and you still have time to get it scheduled and put on the calendar so that way we can record the interview and have it back to you by Thanksgiving so you can watch it with your whole family. All right, I gotta run. I'm already late. People are probably wondering where I'm at. Enjoy this interview with Natalie Kovarik. Natalie Kovarik, welcome to the podcast.
I am so excited to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So you have the only women's podcast that I listen to on a fairly regular basis. It's Discover Ag. Why did you start that podcast?
Well, I am honored. Thank you very much for including us in your lineup. And like a lot of things I have found in my life, it's a common narrative that it is kind of serendipitous. It just happened organically. And that was very much so how Discover Ag started. I had been sharing online for a handful of years on different social media platforms, and I had made a very close friend with a dairy farmer down in New Mexico who also was sharing online. And about a year and a half ago, we came together and started Discover Ag.
And when I catch your stuff, it's the stuff that I would never like naturally find. But I remember listening to one where you guys were talking about Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce and cereal and how they were mixing together cereal and what are, moms thinking about this. This is athletes that are trying to get your kids to eat unhealthy foods. How do you choose the topics that you cover?
Yeah, so when we started Discover Ag, we knew it was pretty important to us that if we were going to do a podcast on agriculture, we didn't want it to be through the conventional lens that agriculture can be talked about or showcased a lot, even stereotyped a lot about. And so, through, again, a process of figuring out what we wanted to show up and talk about every week, what was important to us and what our community enjoyed listening to us talk about, we realized it was kind of somehow us talking about events going on in agriculture, like getting our opinions of things that were happening. And, one way we found our way to that was, I think Tara and I, that's my co-host named Tara, were kind of tired, I guess, for lack of, fancier word, of seeing these sound bites across social media, these reels going viral, these headlines in, New York Times and Washington Post that were talking about food and agriculture. But we're never interviewing a farmer, or we're written by someone who lived in, Upper East Side. Like that was the lens that our industry was getting, talked about, showcased through, highlighted. And so, as I mentioned, we ended up kind of deciding to start the podcast, and we knew that it was going to be important to us to take these, like you said, kind of unconventional topics that really are at the heart of them, food and agriculture and farming, but either weren't being showcased properly in that way, or people didn't connect them that way. They didn't get to that root source. And so, yeah, like you said, we kind of cover these ag, to us, they scream agriculture, but to other people, they would maybe be adjacent. So like you said, Taylor Swift owning, a Christmas tree farm, or Jason Kelce, and Travis Kelce doing, ultra processed foods and campaigning for that. And so, yeah, it's my favorite place, honestly, to show up every single week.
Is it difficult for you to find time to do this? Because podcasting inside of, you're a pharmacist, you're a farmer, you rancher, like raising kids?
Yeah. No, I think when we started, actually, we were kind of like, well, we'll see how this goes. Maybe we'll do seasons, we're not sure what this will be like. And then I think we both realized very quickly that that's really where we love to show up. And so we've made time for it. I mean, it's like that age-old saying, if you love something, you'll make time for it. And so, yeah, we record every single Monday, and then we release every single Thursday.
So this morning, as I was listening to your podcast on the hearings that went on about ag, this is where there was like 4-hour roundtable kicked off by RFK. When he joined Trump's campaign, he said, I'm going to make the rest of my time and energy to focus on the food system. And there was this big thing made rounds in social media and all these clips going on, including Representative Thomas Massey, the libertarian God King, coming out and posting on that everyone should follow Vani Hari, the food babe. And this prompted me to send that out to all my friends and say all our gods are dead, because this king of libertarian thinking is now propping up this. Where do you think all this came from? What is going on right now in the world of people pushing back against big ag and ultra processed food? Yeah,
this was something I think I had felt a shift in for a while. So when Tara and I started our podcast about a year and a half ago, the kind of cool thing, like exactly like we're doing now, when you start a podcast, you kind of start noticing other podcasts. You're aware, you enter this like little podcasting world and bubble. And when we first entered podcasting, somehow we got on the radar of a lot of people in like nutrition kind of podcasts, like not wellness. I would say they were very much so like either doctors, dietitians, or like, I don't know, again, maybe like nutrition. Like that was kind of this little bubble we happened to stumble upon. And so we were doing a lot of guest interviews on different podcasts in, that category. And through those conversations, I could feel like this shift of happening behind the scenes of people's with this rhetoric of, where we were so far, plant-based, and wellness kind of I think everyone can kind of like imagine that stereotype we're coming out of the last 10, 15 years of like how that was, the green smoothies and all, this world that we were living in when it came to food and what was healthy to feed our bodies. And I could feel that pendulum swinging, with, just carnivore, like as a broad example, like we were just going to a very different extreme with food. And I had seen and been having a lot of conversations also around like processed foods, food additives. Some of those questions we were getting on the podcast, like led me to think that this was maybe happening as a shift. But, Tara and I, before we covered the 4-hour roundtable in our podcast last week, we actually covered RFK's speech, his resignation speech he gave as one of our articles, because the premise of our podcast, or the outline of it, is like the top 3 trending topics each week. So we always look for like 3 glaring things that are going on. And for us that week, hearing a presidential candidate devote his resignation speech to food, essentially, which we think of as farming. Not everyone, the other 98% doesn't. They say food is food. But when I hear food, I think of production agriculture. And it was just so alarming to Tara and I that, again, someone at that status who had a platform to speak where everyone would be tuning in chose to talk about food. That's when I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be the start of something really, really big. And then, he followed up with the 4-hour roundtable.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right about it growing into something big. And so I used to be the director of millennial engagement. So my job was to work for Monsanto to help people have a different way of understanding what's the value of GMOs, why is it that farmers use pesticides. And when I was there, the people that needed to be their minds changed on it was the left. It was the left being like, GMOs are unsafe, and like we eat all these healthy foods. That was very much of what was going on. Then the GMO fight rapidly went away, and I think in large part because the activists, they figured out that the money was not in anti-GMO, it was in the glyphosate giant lawsuits, the class action lawsuits. And then it all just kind of calmed down. We had COVID and all kinds of cultural change. And during that time, there was this giant flippening that occurred where the people that were on the right that used to be like, all this stuff we're doing in ag, it's okay, we got to trust what's out there. They now are the conspiracy theorists. They're the ones saying, like, I don't trust anything. And the left is the one that's like, no, trust the science, and big pharma is just great. And so this, I think, is going to catch ag way off guard, because farmers that normally used to have a political home with the right that also supported their use of technology, that right, I think, is eroding, and they're not going to have that. I think the strategies that worked 5-10 years ago to try and protect technologies, that's gone now. And this is a whole new kind of fight.
Yeah, I do think it's a whole new fight. And I said on our podcast episode that I think this is actually one of the most important, fights that agriculture really needs to be paying attention to. There's a lot of different things I want to touch on what you brought up, but going off of, that train of thought, I do think that right now for agriculture, there is a difference between farmers and big ag in general. I think this conversation, as you said, with this sway of the amount of people, right, left, or, indifferent, moderate, I think the majority is going to fall in camp with, not saying RFK politically, but I'm saying this thought process that ultra processed foods is bad, big food is bad, big pharma is bad. I think the percentage of people that will align with that is going to be very, very large. And I think for agriculture, as you pointed out, I don't think, you brought this up to me because I actually reached out to you to get your, pick your brain kind of on the glyphosate conversation. And you mentioned that to me, that this might be the first time that, the agriculture industry, rural America, is maybe at war with, or not aligned typically with who we would politically. And I think that's really, really important with this conversation, knowing how important I personally think how agriculture responds to this big food, big pharma conversation can dictate how the consumer and our relationship with them moves forward. Because I really think, as I said, right now, farmers are the good guy. I still think that we get that pull of percentage trust. I do think there's obviously misinformation and activists, and I think there's this, loud conversation of people that try to, sway the general population on a farmer's role. But how we respond to this, I think, will either lump us in with big food and big pharma or distinguish us out of it. And I think that is something that, as you said, maybe agriculture isn't properly prepared for to have a conversation about.
Yeah, and I'm totally like with you that this is a much larger like package where people are like, I can look around and I see there are obese people. There's all these mental health problems. All the things that get thrown in it. Girls maturing faster than they normally would, and they're saying, not only is it ultra processed foods, but by the way, there's glyphosate in your food. And oh, by the way, there's GMOs in there. And if you're just a person that's like, what is going on? Somebody give me an answer that I can understand. All of that package is going to be delivered into your mind and inside of your little memeplex that describes how you see the world. It's going to include things like we're being poisoned by the farmers. And like, it's going to be indistinguishable. And frankly, there's going to be a whole lot of people that are married to a farmer or who's, are connected to farming that are going to get really, really suspicious of what's going on at the farm. And so this like cultural allies that have been there are disintegrating. And like, the question is, who are you going to go find that wants to be on your team that you can figure out a way to explain and outcompete the memes that are being dropped in by Vani Hari, because that is who wins the cultural war. It's who gets their memes into the minds of the people.
Yeah, there was actually to one of the discussion points Tara and I had when we talked about this is that the round table that, Callie means, Casey means, and RFK, which I would say are probably the three that really headed that round table. There were doctors on it, but there was also just a lot of like influencers, food activists, people that like Vani Hari, Food Babe. I think her degree was in like, I don't even know, science something. I think I remember reading like political science or I can't quite remember, but nothing to do with, the realm she talks in now, which, I can't really point the finger at because I'm coming from a pharmacist background, and I'm online talking about food and farming, but I am a rancher. I did grow up in agriculture, right? So I don't necessarily think your education has to base what you talk about online. But I think a lot of people had an issue with it. There was a lot of, Alex Clark, like just a political, now food wellness podcast host, right? That is on this panel. Like, what is their expertise? Why are they there? What are they contributing? And in my mind, I was like, that makes absolute sense because as you said, they want this roundtable to go to the next step. They're going to want the loudest voice, the person who has the most influence online and that can sway people politically with their words online, with images, with memes, like with a short reel caption, like whatever it is. That is the world we live in, good or bad, indifferent. So I thought it was, interesting to dissect who they had on the panel too.
Well, and who they had on there, like those people are way more effective and they have an opportunity that had not been there before because the nutritionists and the dietitians, whatever the one is that you have to be registered, right? Those groups did get co-opted by big food and big ag. And I watched it happen. I was there when what happens is you have registered dietitians that are the people that go through all the college and all the accreditation, and they want to have conferences. And in order to have those conferences, the membership either needs to pay as individuals or somebody can sponsor it. And if somebody sponsors it, well, then they're the ones that get to put on the luncheon and they're the ones that get to stand up and pay for awards and pay for keynote speakers and pay for these things to all come together. And so you have these registered dietitians that start off by being like, I know that big food isn't doing things that are right, but you know what? I am going to give them a chance because I'm open-minded. And then before you know it, they are so dependent on that money that it becomes ubiquitous. It's like water flowing through there. And so these people that went to school to study this and to come up with their I want to help people are now being so heavily influenced by the food companies and the big ag companies that when it comes time for them to say something, they say things like, Lucky Charms are as healthy for your breakfast as whatever else. And like that does not pass the smell test with anyone. So then they start looking for people like Vani Hari that'll tell the truth compared to what these dietitians are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you're aware of this, but even, maybe 6 months ago, 6 to 9 months ago, probably, there was a huge kerfuffle online with registered dietitians who were paid by, quote unquote, big sugar to say that aspartame was safe and okay. And it made volumes online because they were obviously taking money. This was like a paid social post for the registered dietitian to say that like aspartame right now, science says it's okay, you can have it, everything's fine. And people were very upset that they took money for that. So I feel like there's a lot of things that social media has kind of like tarnished for people when it comes to that, as you mentioned, like being paid, like where does the money come from? And yeah, I think it's even just like the general, I would say layperson is even starting to like catch on to that with like food studies and science too. And they're always like, well, the funding is with it, agriculture funding is by big ag, and it's like made this whole kind of bigger conversation, and I think made people even more leery to like quote unquote trust the science. I think COVID played a role in that. I think that was probably the biggest time in history where you had everyone maybe starting to say like, well, do we trust the science? Before that, I feel like it was like trust the science, and that was pretty well understood for people who aligned with that belief. And then I feel like everything that happened in 2020, there was just this huge movement of people that were like, I don't necessarily know if I trust science anymore. Like I necessarily don't know if I trust our governing bodies anymore, which I think plays a huge role because when we come, as farmers and ranchers and say, well, the EPA says this or the FDA says this or the USDA says this, it almost makes us less credible to like say that we have a governing body supporting us. And so, yeah, I feel like there's just, 1520, like it's this medley of storm of all these different things that has got us to this point where people are, concerned about their food, curious about their food, worried about their food. I just feel like we're at like this huge, as I said, tipping point that is like going to be a really big deal for agriculture moving forward.
Yeah, and like the strategy that happened last time was that all of Big Ag waited forever to wade into the GMO fight. And then when Monsanto started and then started getting other people involved, social media was still really in its infancy. So there was a ton of room to like gain ground and figure out how to get influencers out there. But that's all now well established. So now in order to raise above the fray, you're going to have people that are putting out extraordinary content against people that, and this is what I used to talk about all the time when I was working at Monsanto, is the people like Vani Hari, they're putting out content that they are monetized to do. They derive value from being able to grab attention and turn that into money. And so if you're just competing by like, we want to defend this technology and it feels good and it's the right thing to do, well, you're competing against people that can spend all day, every day on this because that's how they make their money. They aren't spending 99% of their time growing food and then spending 1% trying to talk about it.
Yeah, so Tara and I actually spoke at South by Southwest this past March, and our topic was food influencing and social media and just kind of like the whole food online realm. Like that was what we were talking about. And a lot of it was having to do with fear mongering because, as you said, statistics show that if you can do emotion-based content online, it's like, I don't even remember the statistic now, but like well over 50%, probably 60%, 70% of the chances for that content to go viral. So now you are finding people will intentionally create emotion-based content in order for it to be seen. So, and the best it usually does is like negative emotion. So yes, like very inspiring, positive emotion, content does well too. But for a lot of people, to prove a point, they will lend to fear. They will lend to negativity, like scare tactics, like all those things that can, evoke that emotion in the viewer, is seen more. And Vani Hart, I mean, this is like not to be like a food babe bashing, session here, but we used her as an example in our South by Southwest speech as someone that does this. One, to point that out to people, like they are, conscientiously trying to find the most triggering point for you to be afraid of. Let's say cows being fed candy, cows being fed garbage, whatever it is, so that content will be seen. And two, like you said, they may not be getting money directly from the FDA or the USDA or Big Sugar like the dietitians were, but that is her job. Her job is to influence. Like we get paid by these apps when we get, whether it's directly by the app, if TikTok is paying her for that piece of content to be seen, or if she's selling something else to her community or, getting numbers to go speak or whatever it is, like she is directly tied to how much content can be seen, how big follower her count is, of how much she wants to weigh that piece of content out there. And so I do think we see a lot of twisted, right, content out there for people's advantage of the point they want to get across.
Yeah, this is why I was like very hesitant about this guy, Robbie Starbuck, the guy that's gone out and pointed out like, hey, Tractor Supply, hey, Harley Davidson, you guys are propagating all these things that you don't want. his strategy, what he did to get corporations to change, is precisely what Vani Hari was doing 7-8 years ago, where she was saying, hey, Subway, we found out that your bread has a chemical in it that's the same as yoga mats. We're going to go out and put this negative ad campaign. And Subway is like, whatever we have to do to make this stop, we're going to do. Mm-hmm. And as that energy grows, that mob grows behind these people and they get more and more emotion, then they can target it at these companies. And what will get like washed away in this is that people will gleefully say, we need to get rid of this glyphosate. And the politicians aren't going to stop this. They're going to say, oh, if this is what it takes for me to get elected, then I'll get rid of glyphosate too. And suddenly we'll be using all sorts of other herbicides that like are way worse, and then they'll just start targeting those. Like, if you can get rid of glyphosate, you can get rid of anything.
Yeah, and I think this is the really interesting thing about all of this, and just the way we are with, you know, as you mentioned, like social media dictating consumer perception dictating like laws and regulation, and this circle, like chicken before the egg, right? Like, who knows where it starts, but it's this revolving component of something affecting something. And when you have activists, I guess let's just label them under that. This is where I kind of have an issue with it. It was people who are like, and I talked about this on the podcast with glyphosate. You know, if you want to stake your claim and glyphosate is bad, you can rally a whole lot of people behind you. That you can rally people within agriculture, conventional, non, like you can get people who are like, yeah, like we should be, you know, looking at something different, whatever. You can get all the consumers, all the people behind you. But the bigger question is then what's next, right? And I feel like activists in these platforms, they just care about the one mission. It's like checking the box of, I need to get rid of glyphosate, right? Like there was one speaker on the panel, that was her talking point. Get rid of glyphosate, get rid of glyphosate. It's everywhere. It's killing us. It's sprayed in the millions, like talking point after talking point after talking point. My point is like, okay, well then what's next? Because now are we going to have to like bring in, you know, like a workforce to do all the weeding and tilling that the glyphosate, you know, was doing for us before? Like, we got there for a reason. That's one of the things I say on the podcast all the time is like, we got somewhere for a reason. It's because we didn't have the man force labor or crops were being decimated or whatever it is. Like, glyphosate was created for a reason. It solved a problem, right? You take that away. Do people want to get into like labor force conversation? I mean, sure, it'll be migrant workers out there, you know, like, is that the next stepping point? Like, where does it end? Like, when you have these conversations of like what you are advocating for and advocating against. And I feel like so many people in today's, especially when you get out of the lane and are talking about things that you maybe don't have the background classroom expertise in, or two, with the practical. So case in point, someone on, you know, a 4-hour roundtable that lives in Colorado that just cares about food necessarily doesn't understand what's going on like on the farm practice level. Sure, you take away glyphosate, but like, what's your solution? What comes next? Like, a lot of the rippling effects aren't that much better. Like, we'll probably see greenhouse gas emissions increase. We already have a labor force in agriculture problem. Like, how do we solve that? Like, I think that's my big issue with these activist points. It's like, you stay so narrow focused. It's like you've lost sight of what the entire big picture is. And I think that's really scary when you said it could dictate what happens on our actual farms and ranches.
So I have you could probably call it a philosophy or just a way of thinking about this problem that I'd like to try out on you and see, maybe we can kind of explore it, which is, I think that so many of the problems that we have both in agriculture and in the highly processed foods and people being obese as a result or having all the, is that our time is becoming less valuable. And so we have to constantly find things to save time. And the reason our time is becoming less valuable is because the value of our money keeps going down. And so whereas 2 generations ago, a dad could have had a factory job and he could have provided enough money and enough stability for his family to have his wife at home and raising children, and they might not have had a lot of luxuries, but it was still possible. Well, now we've doubled the workforce, which means there's more people competing after the same jobs, which depresses wages, and the government keeps printing money, and so the value of that money goes down. So people are like, I have to get things done faster. I can't use labor. If we try to use labor, this will never work. So we've got to use chemistry. I can't make food because I don't have time. So I'm going to get processed food because I need to not go to the grocery store as much. And like, all of these things are being stacked on, and we're looking around being like, how do we fix this? Let's knock out glyphosate. When in reality, until you stop our money from degrading in value, none of these problems will be solved. How does that strike you?
No, I actually align with that for just learning about it, I feel like I align with that thought process, pretty well. And I think that's actually something I brought up too about this roundtable is that, they were focused so much on food. And I was like, okay, so take away ultra processed foods or take away glyphosate. Let's stay on the glyphosate conversation because I do think actually like taking away processed foods would probably have a pretty big impact on the health of like our nation, right? So let's take away glyphosate. Does that actually like fix the health of America? Like, that little thing, does that solve all of our problems? And it's like, no, it's like this much bigger picture. You have to have people who actually want to go out and shop locally to eat better. You have to actually have people who want to, as you said, make the food in the home. They have to have the time to do it. Like it's this bigger part. It's just a little puzzle piece in the bigger part of the picture that I like, as negative as it sounds, I always say, like, when people are like, well, let's go back to eating locally or we need to change our food system. I'm like, I have a pretty pessimistic view that I just don't think that will happen because you have to change the absolute basis of how we function as, humans in our society today, and whether the system is rigged against us to not make those changes. As you said, we don't have the time. There's too much money, like all these different things. Or inherently we become like, I don't want to spend, maybe the wife or the spouse, whoever it is, the husband doesn't want to spend the day at home, making the food and doing the preparations. Like whatever that shift has happened from 60, 70 years ago, we're not there as a society anymore. We like food Grubhub. We like postcards or notes or whatever it is where you get your food delivered, directly to your house. Like these are the conveniences we like. And yeah, I think there's a small percentage of an upper echelon that would love to go back to how things were in the 60s, 50s when it came to the food system and what that looked like within our homes and like where you shop from and sourced and how you prepared it. But the vast majority of Americans, I do not think want that change. And so I'm like, when people are out here advocating to, take away processed food and shut down fast foods and all these different changes, eat locally, shop locally, all these different things, I'm like, does America really want that? Or do we just think we want that? Or are we supposed to feel like we want that? Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, will those changes actually happen and get us back to where we want to go? And do we want to go back to there?
I mean, I think like the thing you're describing was, would these changes actually get us there? And no, we're going to have another bigger problem behind us to be able to try and fix. And this is why it drove me insane that Thomas Massie was out there promoting that roundtable on food. And it's because Thomas Massie was saying, hey, look, I think the way that we can make our food system better is cut down the amount of rules that the USDA and the EPA and the FDA, how many rules they have, how many bureaucrats they have. Because the reality is they continue, these giant bureaucracies say, hey, we're here to help by creating more rules and more hoops for you to jump through. And I always used to say this when I would talk with activist groups. You did the work of Monsanto becoming huge for them. And the way that you did that was that you made it so every time you went out and protested and you got people to feel like there were millions of people against Monsanto, then Monsanto went to the regulators and they said, you know what? If people are scared, let's just add 3 more years of testing onto that. It'll cost us $10 million more per year, but we'll just have $30 million more. Now, they would do that because they knew that that just made a bigger moat between their competitors and what they have to get through. So in effect, they just, took a little bit off of their bottom line, but made it so if anybody else ever came up with a new pesticide that worked, a new GMO, they would say, that's a really nice product, but there's no chance you're going to be able to bring that all the way to market. So why don't you sell it to us for a fraction of the price? And so Thomas Massie was the guy that I thought, hey, maybe you can break through and start breaking up these bureaucracies. But if what we do instead is put people that are from that way of thinking in charge, they're going to be taking out products that are, maybe they're good, maybe they're bad, I don't know, but they don't have a replacement strategy to figure out how to move us forward.
Well, and as you even said, I think like it's a great question. Is less regulation like? So I am never like usually voting for more regulation for governing bodies, right? Like that's generally like not something I'd be like, yes, like let the government come to, to our ranch, especially like, talking agriculture and like dictate more of like what the practices that need to happen on our operation as a rancher. But like, again, going back to before things were regulated, we created regulation because they weren't, because we were having illnesses. Like I always talk about this with milk. It's like we got to processing, our milk, pasteurizing it because we were having illnesses, with unpasteurized, right? Like, so they had to do some sort of regulation and control over it. And so all these people that want to strip it away, it's like, okay, we're just going to do a big circle again. Like the extremist view, whichever side it is, take away all the governing body, only listen to the governing body. I'm like, we're missing the point. The answer is in the middle. Until we realize that we need some sort of governing body, we have to figure out how to, make it, whatever, work better for us. Like, that's the answer. It's always going to be a middle ground. And right now, I feel like with social media, as we alluded to before, we're in a world of extremes. We're in a world of extremes when it comes politically. We're in a world of extremes like online. Like, everything seems to be in the extremes. And I'm like, we're never going to be able to find the answer that actually moves us forward. Again, with our food system, going back to how things were in the 30s and 40s is not the answer. Maybe, spraying glyphosate on our food isn't the answer either, but it's like, it's not one or the other. It's like a meld of somewhere in between. And I feel like that conversation somehow is missing. Like a moderate approach, a logical approach is missing to the conversation.
Well, and I think that I'm going to disagree with you, because I actually do think we need a massive reduction in regulations, almost to the point of them being no regulations. And I'm sure my audience is rolling their eyes and flipping out. But I'll take your example of raw milk. Now, I say this knowing people will throw pitchforks at me when I go back out to do speaking. I know the people that get really angry about this. But like, it's a conversation that's not happening. And it's when those regulations were put into place to make sure that we had pasteurization and that we, had cleanly conditions, farm conditions were different. Farms were different themselves. And we have learned so much more about like the healthcare. We have more technology that makes it easier to, cool milk or to keep it safe. But we are still using the regulations that we invented in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And it's not keeping up with, well, maybe we could have milk that doesn't have to be super heat treated and that people are allowed to drink this. And as long as they know what they're buying, they get to make these choices on their own. But now if you go talk with any big ag group, any checkoff group, they are not allowed to spend any time talking about that, because the structure of the checkoff itself says you're not allowed to say these things. And so there's a whole big side of the conversation that ag is not allowed to talk about. And certainly the groups that ag is putting their money and faith into to go out and fight the good fight for them, their hands are tied behind their back.
No, I'm glad you brought this up, because I do think it's an important conversation to have. And tying it back to glyphosate, we'll stick on the same train of thought. I talked about this a little bit, about how like science is meant to challenge itself. Like, that's the basis of science, right? Like, science doesn't arrive at an endpoint and then you're like, oh, okay, well, we figured it out. The science is done. Like, it should always be challenging itself, right? And I do think that as you alluded to with milk, that, we are basing a lot of some of these regulations off of, decades of that it's been time lapse, right? And so for me, like, I brought up recently, we had a conversation about Tyson, because there was not Minnesota, I'm lacking where he's from. Maybe it was Minnesota. There was a farmer that is suing Tyson right now. Not crazy news, right? Like, Tyson probably gets sued all the time. But anyway, I brought up the whole, basically structurally integrated system that the poultry industry is set up. And I was like, just a question. Like, I don't have a background in chicken. I grew up on a cattle ranch. I'm on a cattle ranch now. I have very minimal poultry exposure. I've actually never even been in a poultry farm. So during that podcast episode, I posed a lot of questions to anyone tuning in our Disco community that was a poultry farmer. And I said, like, just message us and let us know. Do you like vertical integration? Is this set up like for the farmer to succeed? Like, is this farmer who sued Tyson, his experience an accurate representation across the fold of farmers in the poultry industry? Or is he an isolated event where other poultry farmers are like, hey, man, I don't know why you're making this in the news. Like, I've got a really good thing going here. We really like how this is set up, in the poultry industry. Like, you're kind of ruining it for us. You're tarnishing this perception, right? I was like, genuinely cared. Like, because as farmers, if we don't like the way the system's set up, we have to challenge that status quo, even if it means challenging agriculture. So like you said, when it comes to raw milk or processed, if we could get to a point where we could have it, because I'd be curious to get into your opinions of like federal mandation versus state mandation, and like what that, like where you think it should lie with food. Like, does state make it more messier? Like, should it be, federal? But I'm like that, like, sometimes I feel like, and going back to the glyphosate, sometimes I feel like in agriculture, talk about pitchforks coming for me after I say this probably, we're afraid to challenge our own industry in a healthy, constructive way because we don't want to go against our industry. And it's like, if you're a conventional farmer and you don't like glyphosate, as much as it probably, you don't want to be on the side of, not saying you would be on the side of, the food babe, but if that's the side you align on, then you have to come to qualms that that's the side you align on to make the changes that you want in the industry, whatever it is, raw milk, pasteurized milk, glyphosate, organic, like wherever it is, like we have to be able within the agriculture industry to be able to challenge these practices, tools, guidelines we've had for decades in order to move forward in the most robust way to continue the agriculture industry.
Yeah, and I like to the conversations that are not allowed to be had. It's so funny because when you're in ag, they just become so commonplace that you can't have them, that you oftentimes don't even realize, like, oh, we stopped talking about this years ago because we were told we weren't allowed to, and then to bring it back up, it just doesn't happen. And I think there's raw milk is an easy one. I mean, I've seen like all out brawls break out with like a mom yelling, my child died from botulism 7163, and the other people being like, but it's my right. And like, nobody wants those fights. But if you don't have those discussions, then it's just, we'll just put in a rule and nobody can do this, and we've made up the choice for you. And that's not good.
No, so I actually, after our episode aired, I had one of my good friends who they conventionally farm, about an hour and a half away from us here in Nebraska. And she messaged me, and her family, she's very, very, very particular about their family, what they eat. Her oldest child actually has, I can't think of his diagnosis, but they have to have gluten-free household. They also have to have a dye-free household. And just through that, she has gotten obviously very into, preservatives, all additives, like all the different things when it comes to the food system. And she messaged me after our episode aired and was like, thank you so much for just posing the question of like, do conventional farmers actually like the way, like, because, sorry, this is jumping around a little bit for the listener, but in the roundtable, one of the spokesperson talked about how her quote was like 85% of the seeds come from chemists in farming. And she's like, we have chemists out in the field, not farmers, like talking about the way that buying seed is set up, like, big seed corporations. And so I brought that conversation back to the podcast and said, like, do farmers like that? Do they like having to buy, the seeds the way that, for lack of a better word, like seed infrastructure is like set up in agriculture right now? If not, we need to say something about it. And so I was bringing up this conversation about like, how we're buying our seeds, like how that is structured, spraying glyphosate and all of this. And she messaged me and was like, thank you so much for bringing that up. She's like, as a conventional farmer, I feel guilty, talking about that, like with my husband, bringing that conversation up to it. She's like, I care so much about what comes into our household that obviously I've had questions about, like, should we be allowing glyphosate in our household? Should we be spraying glyphosate in our fields? And she's like, and to what you said at the very start of this, you're going to have people that like, historically align with certain sides politically or certain beliefs politically start to feel a little challenged and question different things internally about this. And she is a perfect example of that, who probably totally leans right, votes right, has always been supportive of big ag, or, like there isn't a big ag, there isn't factory farms, like all that conversation, like so anti all of it, to now kind of being like, I don't know. Should we be spraying glyphosate? Like, what does that mean? Like posing and raising those questions when she feel like she doesn't really, maybe not even doesn't have a space to, but like feels guilty as a conventional farmer, even thinking that or questioning that.
Well, one of the parts of the conversation that people aren't allowed to have, and it wasn't talked about at the roundtable, I only saw clips of that, so I don't really know, but one of the big things that shapes our agricultural system is the mandates that you have to have ethanol in gasoline. So that makes it so if you're in the state of Illinois and you want to buy a gallon of gasoline, a percentage of that is regular gasoline made from petroleum mixed with the gas made from corn. Well, if you didn't have that mandate in, you wouldn't have that demand for corn. Mm-hmm. And if you didn't have that demand for the corn, the price of corn would drop down. And so farmers don't want this because the value of their land is dependent in part on how much can you produce on this land. And so all the farmers are like, no, we want to keep the ethanol. That's a good mandate. It's good for us. It's good for Americans. But is it? Because if you're using that really fertile, beautiful ground to grow corn that people aren't using they have to use, they don't have a choice, then you're that much further away from creating a system where it's cheaper to produce food more locally, for that somebody could buy that acreage up and be creating farms that produce food just straight for farmers market or for local groceries. But I mean, try and bring up the ethanol conversation with most farmers in the Midwest, and it's dead on arrival. It may be dead with you, I don't know.
No, I feel like that's I'm like the type of person that gets overwhelmed at the gas station trying to pick like between the different like melts of gases. I'm like, ethanol is like way over my head. But no, I think it alludes to like one of the reasons why we honestly started our podcast is because, and it's a scary thing, I think, to make a change in the food system because it affects so many other things within food, fiber that you're almost hesitancy to, right? Like if it's not broke, don't fix it. But you're like, I'm not sure we're going along and like, I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe it is broken.
Right? Yeah. Like we don't really know, but it's like, we don't also know what taking out this one little hay would do to the entire haystack, because it's like, you have to think about X, Y, and Z, which back to why we started the podcast. No one I feel like is having those conversations of like, okay, well, do you know that if you take away this from a farmer, it actually means X, Y, and Z? And do you know if, you ask us to start doing this instead of what we're doing now, this could be a potential repercussion. Like all those ripple things that like we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes, I feel like no one, when it comes to these articles about food and farming or food online, they don't talk about them. They don't understand them, right? It's like there's a much, much bigger picture than just like, should we be spraying glyphosate in crops or not? Should we allow raw milk or not?
Well, and to your point, don't even understand them. I remember when I had like a deeply humbling moment where I was hanging out with a scientist and we had gone to some college to speak at, and we had gotten asked some questions, and I remember turning to him and being like, Doug, it's so funny that these people don't believe the science on glyphosate, like it's just so obvious. And he was like, well, the reality is you don't actually understand the science behind glyphosate. You maybe have like looked through one paper, but you don't actually understand it. I do, and you trust me. And so therefore you go out and talk about this with other people. But if I were to ask you, what is the mechanism that works and how do you know how quickly it degrades and, all of the principles that you would have to know to feel really good about this, you, Vance, have faith. And I was like, damn it. Like I had really fully come to the belief that I had arrived on the idea that glyphosate was safe and that I knew it, but it was totally a delusional thing because he was right. I had read a couple of papers. I'd kind of read papers about those papers, but that like most of the people around me were so pro glyphosate that I was like, look, when you talk to the people that know, we all know this. And I think that's true of almost everything that we know almost nothing at all. And most of what we believe and what we preach is based on what our tribe around us believes in.
Okay. And so you brought me back full circle to like, what I started this conversation out with saying is that like, this is why this is the most important time for agriculture with the shift in the food system, because we have to be on the side where they trust the farmers and ranchers on, out in the field that they are doing the best thing for their farm, their ranch, their family, and thus the entire nation of families, right? And like, for me, that is the big picture. It's not about education. It's not about getting people to understand what glyphosate is or isn't, or, all of these details that sometimes we argue or educating our consumer, which you'll hear all the time. For me, it's like about none of that. That is not what will get us to come out on the right side of this and be seen as the people that are doing the right thing every single day out for their animals and out on the land. It is trust. That is what we have to focus on when it comes to consumer. And that's why, because they so heavily distrust big food and big pharma, if agriculture does not figure out, where we align with this conversation and this movement of food, we're either going to be seen as trusted or not trusted. And that's my big aha moment and take away from the whole 4-hour roundtable is like, we have to come out of this being the trusted farmer and rancher that's making the healthy potato that big food is turning into the potato chip. And that's the problem, not the farmer, not the potato, not the soil, etc.
Yeah, and ag, to your point, has like a very interesting two-part thing. There's no big pharma plus all the pharmacists. Like people believe that the pharmacists are in on big pharma. But with ag, you do have big ag, like the Monsanto's, now Bayer and and Corteva, and then you have their customers, and they're not the same thing. And it is in the interests of the farmers not to be the same thing. But there is a huge vulnerability that farmers have right now, and it's going to become more and more important if the economy continues to struggle, which is because of our ag's large ability to influence politicians. Even though they haven't been able to get the Farm Bill passed, they're going to eventually push through like, well, what we need to do is, because farmers aren't doing very well, we need to give them farm aid. So we need to send people checks that allow them to stay in business, because if we don't, during these bad years, farmers might go out of business. Well, every single consumer that is sitting at home watching their bank accounts go down, 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 and their credits go up, 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 like they're going to say like, wait a second, why did those farmers get money from taxpayers for this? Like, they're in on this game that has nothing to do with me. And this is one of those things that, like, if you don't hand out those payments, there's going to be a lot of land that changes hands, and there are going to be farms that go out of business. I don't know if that's a good thing, but I can tell you that this is a vulnerability that the people that are at that round table, if they aren't already pitching, throwing at that, they are going to.
Yeah, so I did watch the entire 4-hour roundtable, also multiple times. I probably spent like 6 hours watching it because I had to like rewind, listen, got distracted, whatever. I went into it thinking I would hear the word big ag repeatedly and GMOs repeatedly. And then I knew there would be the glyphosate conversation. I also thought I would hear organic quite a bit, which I did. There was one speaker who, I think maybe her talking points were organic. But other than that, no one else really mentioned organic. But those were kind of, the buzzwords I thought I'd hear. Big ag, GMOs, organic, and glyphosate. The amount of times they said big ag was shocking to me. I bet it was less than 5. I wish I would have counted it. It was very small. Like, I was so pleasantly surprised. The amount of times they said the word farm bill, I was shocked. I didn't even know these people knew what the farm bill was. I mean, half of farmers and ranchers don't know what is actually in the farm bill, And for that round table, I think probably almost every single one of the speakers referenced the farm bill. I could not believe how much it was referenced. I was in shock. And to what you said, they're referencing it because right now, as you said, GMOs are out and the things that our consumers are talking about are not that anymore. I am surprised, but what the consumers are talking about right now, I'm hearing over and over again, is subsidies. The next attack on consumers is subsidies. They are very, very angry of their perception of what subsidies is. And it's another tool that will, if we let it get out of hand or let, the food babe dictate what should be, subsidized and isn't, or if they should exist or not, will have very, very real implications for agriculture. And so who steps up for that? Is it the food babe? Like, how are we as an industry? Again, this is so important for us to pay attention to this conversation. How are we going to figure out how to address our concerns, what we want out of that moving forward, so that when we can come to the table, when, the food babe says, I don't want subsidies, there was a direct quote from someone who said, our government, our money is going to the government to spray the farms with billions of dollars of pesticides that in turn then, destruct our gut biome. Like, that was the essential thing. Like, they are on the subsidy conversation and they do not like it.
Yeah, and the subsidies is a wild thing because, as I understand it, it used to be that the government literally subsidized things more directly, and now the subsidies are much more like insurance subsidies. So we're going to make it really inexpensive for you to be able to make sure that you have insurance, and that insurance is like, if your crops don't yield at the, like, this is your base layer of yield that you're supposed to get, and if you don't get all the way up to that, then we will cover you. And so you pay insurance and we'll bring you up to that level, which essentially means as long as you're buying insurance, it's very difficult for you to go out of business. And that's why the ethanol is tied into the farm bill, is tied into these subsidies, because the value of that they're going to cover you is not to like show up with corn and dump it in your farm. They're going to give you the money that you could have produced and how many bushels you used to produce per acre. And like, I don't know. Is that fair? Maybe I'm on the side of Vani Hari about that. Like, maybe that's not right, because my business doesn't have like an insurance that if I don't make the money that I made over the last 5 years that you're going to cover me. I don't know that that's it's certainly not equitable.
No, and again, this is like another trigger point for agriculture, right? Because you're going to have people listening that are very much so pro subsidies and are like, don't change that. And then it's like a very division point for agriculture. I was listening to a really interesting conversation that was talking about like specialty crops. Like they're like historically, if you're going on like the insurance conversation, like, the way so to put it broad speaking, I guess, like they're not as subsidized as, corn and soybeans are. Like, is that fair within agriculture? Like, do we need to shift it? Like it raises all these questions that I don't think farmers are sometimes comfortable raising and then stating their opinion on, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think the thing that is going to be interesting is to find out who are going to be the allies of the farmers that want to preserve the technology that they have, because I know that you've said it a couple of times, you're not into ultra pasture or ultra processed food. In my house, we eat almost nothing ultra processed, but it's because we have time, or that's what we've decided to dedicate all of our time to is cooking and entertaining our children when we're not at work. But like, I made some changes in my life in the last 6 months to switch to way less carbs, like virtually zero carbs. And my life has been transformed by that. So like all of a sudden I'm like, wait a second, you guys told me about the food pyramid and about how this is supposed to work and I'm supposed to have this many servings of grains. And now I'm discovering, like, one, who created that food pyramid, and that doesn't seem right. And then two, like, maybe we should be producing a lot more proteins and fats and a lot less carbohydrates. And so all of a sudden I start being like, yeah, I don't like what they're saying about glyphosate and GMOs, but they are the team that's going to lower the amount of ultra processed foods in our diet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I know. I mean, I agree. I agree quite frankly with that. Like our household is very, very similar. I mean, I've had my qualms with the food pyramid for a long time, like the demonization of saturated fats. I mean, I think there were so many points historically that again got us to where we are, and I think I'm not surprised that we're in the storm that brewed. It brewed for decades with all these different mandates, all these different things, and I'm not surprised we are where we are now with this conversation. I just think it's going to be interesting to see where we come out of it, honestly, as an industry.
Well, Natalie, I had all these questions about the inner workings of your mind and who you turn to for advice and what it's like to have faith in things. But this has been a far more interesting and engaging conversation. So I'll have to have you on another time to talk about the inner workings of your mind. I
would be happy to just sit down and have a crow conversation anytime.
Well, thanks so much for coming on. If people wanted to check out what you're doing, where should they go for that?
Yep. If you're tuning into this, you're probably a podcast person. So the best place to find me would be our podcast, which is Discover Ag. We are a Thursday episode, and you can listen to us anywhere podcasts are available. So wherever you tune in, you can find us. And then I am on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and that's just under my name, Natalie Kovarik.
Well, Natalie, this has been quite enjoyable. You are a difficult person to nail down because you have so much going on, but I loved it. I'm so glad we were able to find time to do this.
That was just an illusion, I swear.
Well, thanks for coming on.